Hello and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we take a look at today's news, views, trends, and opinions from a decidedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Shane Patrick Connolly, and with me today is John J. Miller. He is the director of the journalism program at Hillsdale College and a writer for National Review, The Wall Street Journal, and other important national publications. He's also the founder of the College Fix, a news website. Well, welcome, John.
Thanks for having me on, Shane.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get into the meat of today's topic, I thought we'd give our viewers a little opportunity to learn a little bit more about you and how you got interested in this business of journalism.
Well, I've always been a reader ever since I was a kid, and I like to write as well. When I got to college, I discovered a newspaper at the University of Michigan called the Michigan Review. And I started writing for it, fell in love with that, became its editor, and just never looked back. Got into political journalism. I was out in Washington, D.C. for 20 years, and then got the call to go to Hillsdale College and teach journalism there in Michigan.
Oh, very good. So when you joined this review, was this a conservative publication? Did it have a particular point of view?
It was a student-run, conservative, and libertarian publication at the University of Michigan.
And what attracted you to that?
I loved the ideas in it. I liked the seriousness of it. I liked the causes it took up on campus. We had a speech code imposed upon the student body by the administration when I was there. I thought that was wrong. I thought that was not what the university should be all about. And we argued against it and got involved in many other controversies and news as well, and just had a great time doing it.
Well, very good. Well, speaking of the news, the current president of the United States talks a lot about the news, particularly fake news. And you'll be talking at the Liberty Forum about this issue. What defines fake news in today's journalist world?
Well, one of the things I'm going to say is that we've always had it. The term is new. It's coined or at least popularized by our president. And now we hear it all the time. We've always had a problem with fake news in this country, really. And all, as long as people have lied, there's been fake news. But the news coverage throughout American history has been full of problems, full of challenges, sometimes full of lies, and we're seeing a moment right now of maybe more than ever before. And I like to say that journalism has never been worse. It's also never been better. There are some really great aspects to it right now, but some terrifically bad ones as well.
So you're a student of history of journalism, I take it, as well. And so what is good now, historically, in journalism?
Well, what's great now is that we've never had better access to good information as quickly as possible. I remember when I first got into journalism, I went off to Washington, D.C., and I worked at a magazine. And if I wanted to get the senator's comments from yesterday, I'd have to pick up a phone, call an office, hope to get through to a press secretary, beg that person to fax me a set of remarks, and go stand by a machine and hope it comes out in this weird scroll-like document that I could then use and maybe quote a line from it. Now I can just go look up the speech and find it and get the quote, and it takes seconds to do. So we have this, as journalists, we have this tremendous power to access that kind of information. In fact, everybody has that ability. You can go find the news yourself in lots of ways, and I don't take that for granted. I mean, it's, pull out a phone and say, gee whiz, we have these wonderful phones with this powerful technology. It wasn't always that way, and what a great tool that is for finding the truth. It's also easily abused, and we have lots of people who cut corners and are willing to don't do their homework and are willing to shade the news and come up with their own strange interpretations because they have a political agenda that they're pursuing. But the news has this power to tell the truth like never before when journalists take maximum advantage of these technological advances.
Now, do we see a difference between how the news is being interpreted, if you will, at the national level versus local journalists? I know a lot of local journalists, and they strive to get the story right and balanced, but we see a definite I think, a skewing, many of us perceive, of the news we get on a national level.
Well, newsrooms everywhere are riddled with political liberals. The liberals dominate the industry at every level. Now, at the local level, a lot of the news has to do with the local high school's football team, or cops and courts, and things that aren't quite as politically charged. And so you'll get journalists who will just go and try and tell the story and take the right photo and supply the information that a community wants. As you start moving up the ladder and get into state capitals and finally our national capital, all the news is politics, right? That's, you know, Washington, D.C. is a one industry town, and it's all politics, right? And so the reporters will do that, and they often come in with their own political ideas, and that's where you can get into some trouble, when they start trying to enact an agenda and then claiming that they don't. Right? I'm a big advocate of opinion journalism, reporting from a perspective. I do that myself from National Review, but also try and be fair, also try and tell the truth, and so on. But there are others who will abuse that and will claim that they are telling the truth when in fact they're trying to skew it.
Now, do you think that some may simply be myopic and think they're telling the truth, or are they really actively trying to skew the story because, say, they don't like Trump, or whatever the issue is that they're working on?
It's both. There's a determination sometimes to get Trump every day, right? This is my job. I wake up in the morning, I want to get Trump. There are a lot of other reporters who are liberal who don't think that way. They don't get up in the morning and say, how am I going to mess with the Republicans today? But at the same time, they have biases they don't even recognize when they report stories, and they make assumptions about events and often this comes from a faulty education, where they don't know, for example, when a minimum wage bill comes up in a legislature, they don't think to ask the question, well, if you raise the minimum wage, will teenagers lose jobs? They don't think to ask that question. They say, oh, this is good for working people, and they'll report the story that way. And so you get a kind of skewed approach to a subject like that.
Right. So it's based in their own assumptions that may preclude them from asking the right questions.
Right.
And I've seen that in talking with people working on these journalism integrity projects. Spoke with one reporter who didn't seem to understand a liberty or conservative perspective at its root. And so I had a great opportunity to discuss those kind of things with that person, and kind of revealed to them something they didn't know.
Well, they're often never exposed to that in their educations or in growing up. And it's amazing how poorly liberals understand conservative ideas, partly because they've never heard them before. They've never heard them presented in a certain way before. I found conservatives often understand liberal arguments much better because they hear them all the time, getting them from high school, getting them from the media, and so on. But you're right. Sometimes a reporter will meet an intelligent conservative and need an education.
So that goes to something very close to you. You work in academia at Hillsdale College. You teach students about journalism. And what is your approach? How do you expose them to different ideas and get them to be the best journalists they could be?
So I run the journalism program at Hillsdale College. It's a small liberal arts college in rural Michigan. And we teach journalism by having students actually do journalism. In other words, we get them to work at the school paper, we get them to work at the radio station, because in journalism, the best way to learn the craft is actually do it, to let the experience become the teacher. So we get them to write articles on everything from campus clubs to what a speaker said, to what's happening in town on city council. And so they do this over and over and over again. And they learn how to do it from their peers, who are a senior who's an editor who will teach a freshman how to write a lead, but also from faculty instructors. And we do a little bit of we do a little bit of work in the classroom, talking about the basics of style and how to do an interview, what it means to go off the record, etc. But mostly we try and force them into the newsroom and into the radio studio and get them to do the work, because that's the best way that they can learn. The other thing we do is we have a journalism program, but journalism is not a major at Hillsdale College. It's a minor. We don't want it to be a major. So, for example, we want students to major in a traditional academic discipline where they can learn something real that they can bring into their lives as journalists. So, for example, I had a student a few years ago who, when I met her when she was a freshman, I asked the question I often ask of these young people, which is, what do you want to do when you grow up? What kind of job would you like to have when you graduate, or maybe 5 or 10 years after graduation? And she said to me, I'd like to be an economics reporter for the Wall Street Journal. You know, remarkably precise goal.
That's very precise.
For an 18-year-old. But I loved it, right? And I thought, well, we can work on that. And what do you think she should major in? You know, journalism?
Probably not. Probably finance or
exactly
economics.
So at Hillsdale, you have to major in something else. So she did economics, and guess where she's working today? She's at the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, fantastic.
But her head is full of knowledge. It's been filled by knowledge with our excellent economics faculty, and she's taken course after course after course on economics and really learned that material, and that's what makes her a good reporter today. Not because she sat through, 20 classes on, media and society or whatnot.
So, talking about that, so how do we teach students to detect this bias, or do we have to, or we just teach them to be critical thinkers?
Everybody has to know how to detect the bias, and so there's never been a greater burden on readers than today to detect bias, because we're inundated with sources, and we need to understand what's a good source and what's a bad source more than ever before, because there are so many people trying to abuse us with their views and their biases, and so you need to understand what's a reliable source and make sure that that's what you're reading, and read it with a critical eye.
So now there are this a plethora of sources, this democratization of media. It's available everywhere through blogs and podcasts and daily postings and emails that go out and all this. But deciphering the truth becomes I think a bigger challenge, does it, than when perhaps papers were labeled as the Republican Gazette or the Democrat leader or whatnot?
Well, that's a great question, because back in the 19th century, newspapers were closely aligned with political parties. And as you say, there's the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, for example, which is the major daily newspaper in Little Rock, Arkansas. And it was aligned with the Democratic Party. And the fact that it's still called the Democrat in its title is a vestige of that, of its old-fashioned roots that way. Now, in the 20th century, there was a move toward the professionalization of journalism, a move toward objectivity, and a sense that we can rather than pick a side, we're gonna talk to both sides and report the news fairly and objectively. And that's a nice goal. It was often poorly realized. And so you had media organizations that would claim to be unbiased, but in fact were full of liberal biases. Oftentimes they didn't even recognize their own biases and would deny it when challenged. But conservatives saw it all the time. And so figures like Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather, were news readers at CBS. Millions of Americans would tune into them and get their news from them, but they were thoroughgoing liberals, and it affected what they said. They claimed to be objective, but they really weren't.
So there's a thing called the Trump effect that has been referred to with respect to the media and with relation to bias. What is the Trump effect, and what has it exposed in the media?
Well, there's a sense that that we've seen this before with other presidents. Bush derangement syndrome, now Trump derangement syndrome. It sort of makes people crazy. They can't think straight when they're confronted with this personality, and so there's a sense with Trump that a lot of journalists are out to get him. Right, that they're going to wake up this morning and what are we going to do today to get Donald Trump? And they're not merely taking a kind of adversarial stance that an ordinary reporter might take when he asks a hard question. They want to get Trump. This is their mission. It's not to report what he said or what he did. get some quotes, allow for a little bit of analysis. It's how can we portray this in the worst possible light? And so it affects everything from New York Times headlines to how they report stories, and it makes you wonder what you can trust anymore.
So speaking of headlines, the Washington Post had a recent headline about Abu Bakr.
The austere religious scholar.
The austere, yes, exactly.
So
al-Baghdadi. Yeah.
So right. So American military forces caught and then killed the leader of ISIS, this great terrorist evildoer in the world, and this is great news for America, yeah. Right? This is an accomplishment for our military. It makes us all safer, and puts the caliphate a little bit further off. When this happened, the Washington Post immediately posted an obituary headline saying that he had died, and identified him not as a terrorist leader, not as a person who sought to kill Americans, not as a murderer and rapist of thousands and thousands of people in the Middle East, but as an austere religious scholar. And you just got the sense from seeing that the headline writer could not quite write the headline that might have, even in the smallest way, redounded to the benefit of President Trump, who, of course, had made the order that made possible this accomplishment. It was like, I cannot write the headline that'll, even in a small way, help this president. And so they wrote this. People called him on it immediately. This was all over Twitter. And the Washington Post changed the headline to something more reasonable and accurate, too, about who this person really was. But you get a sense that in the newsroom at the Washington Post, they're always trying to think of what is the headline that'll be of the least benefit or do the most damage to this president. Well,
and that leads to another question that I have about policing of the media. There's a lot of calls for outlets like Facebook and Twitter to be the judge of the accuracy of reports. Now, but I think that the democratization of media has the positive side in that we saw what happened with the Washington Post. They were ridiculed for this absurd headline, and they corrected it. Is that more the solution, this free market of ideas, or would you like to see government action of some kind, or Facebook action, corporate action?
Well, I prefer this self-corrective ability. So in another generation, the Washington Post would have printed that headline and would have been printed in the newspapers, and it would have gone out that day, and that would have been the headline of the day. They couldn't have changed it. I mean, unless you get into this situation where I think you only see in movies where the editor, runs in and says, "Stop the presses," right, and actually change the headline. But that really rarely happens, and it's also tremendously expensive if it ever does. But now we have this ability for readers to react, to point out to maybe a more senior editor at the Washington Post that maybe that's not the best headline. You could do something different. The Post actually can change the headline and improve it. So I think that's all a good thing. They can get this kind of reader response and maybe make a better judgment having had it. Of course, there is this fundamental problem of how does the mistake even occur in the first place. I mean, journalists will always make mistakes. They always will. Their work is on public display like few other professions, and no journalist has gone through a career without making a mistake. But this is a mistake, a real serious mistake of judgment, and it seems like they make it again and again and again.
So in the headline writing process, I'm just curious as to whether there's any vetting that happens. I've seen this at other times when headlines haven't really accurately reflected what's in the substance of the article. Is there a vetting process these go through?
Well, part of the problem is, writers don't write their own headlines, right? They write the copy of their stories. They can suggest a headline, but ultimately the person who writes the headline is an editor who will oversee a page, and there's a person who is thinking about, how will this lay out on a page? How much space do I have for a headline? Where is it? Do I have 8 words or do I have 3 words? And so you sometimes get, headline writers, editors who are headline writers who are very quickly trying to summarize stories and doing, the very best they can. In the case of the Washington Post story, I think there was not just an innocent mistake. I think there was a kind of agenda behind it.
This kind of groupthink that takes place in the liberal media
Yeah,
world.
there absolutely is a herd mentality. I've watched it in action as a reporter covering events, and reporters gathering around talking about what is the news from this press conference and kind of coming to decisions and then reporting on it. There's definitely a kind of groupthink that occurs, and when the newsroom is dominated by liberals, as so many are, you often get this kind of bias. And sometimes they know they're doing it, and sometimes they don't.
So, going back to these technology companies that serve as platforms for communication, one of the challenges in vetting the truth of a story or not is that it starts in one place and it finds repetition. It's placed on many different sources, and then people repost these things. And pretty soon you have a vast body of the wrong information. Have you seen this happen? How do we adjust for that or correct for that?
Well, everybody has seen it happen, and it's a problem. And I don't envy these technology companies that have to deal with some of the pressures that come from that. Having said that, my strong preference would be just to allow all kinds of conversation and discussion, and for them not to get into the business of trying to determine what's valuable news and what's not, and what's a satirical website and what's not, and so on, and just have a kind of marketplace of ideas where readers can determine what's a good source and what they're going to believe, and so on. And that's not a perfect solution, but there won't be a perfect solution to this. There will always be people who want to manipulate systems to spread disinformation, and but a kind of censorship, I think is a bad idea, and it's definitely not in the interests of conservatives, because they are the ones who will be censored over and over again.
Right, the folks that we're talking about here in the bastions of liberalism, New York and Washington, who set the tone, will probably be the ones who would be called upon to monitor what's true.
Yeah, I mean, the censors will be liberal, and we've already seen a little bit of this go on right now with, for example, the PragerU videos on YouTube. Dennis Prager has these wonderful short videos where he has experts come on, often conservative or libertarian experts, but giving little lectures on a political subject or on something from history. And there have been coordinated efforts to have YouTube remove them or make them hard to get to on its platforms, and they've had some success in pulling these things off, and it's outrageous. But it's a coordinated attack on them by people whose purpose is censorship, to remove conservative voices from a conversation. So I think that's something we would like to avoid. What it means is we're going to have. So what it means is social media will be messy, and there will be things we don't like, things that may offend us. There will be fake news, but I prefer that to people who want to maybe protect us from false journalism, right? I mean, that just sounds a little too North Korean to me.
Absolutely, I agree. So let me hear more about this College Fix, the College Fix news website. What is the mission of the College Fix?
So this is a website I started about 10 years ago, and the idea is to find student reporters on campuses all around the country who will tell true stories about what's really happening. And so they're reporting stories for the College Fix on free speech, on what kinds of political speakers are allowed on their campuses, on what their curriculum looks like, on what's taught in the classroom. And what they're doing is they're reporting the stories. I have a team of professional editors who recruit them and work with them so that they're doing straight news stories on what's really happening. And they're telling stories that their own mainstream campus papers don't want to report on or don't care about or don't think is news. You know, if a conservative speaker is disinvited from a particular campus, we'll tell a straight news story about what happened. You won't necessarily get that from a left-wing student newspaper on campus, and you won't necessarily find the New York Times particularly interested in that story. But our students will report it, they'll talk about all this stuff, and they'll just present the straight facts on the website. And so the College Fix is a news website that is meant to have daily information about what's really happening on our campuses, number one. And number two, we're trying to excite young people in the idea of becoming journalists and going into the news media professionally and finding, training them up a little bit, showing them what fun you can have telling true stories, and encouraging them into the profession. We have a couple different missions, but it's basically to tell stories and to promote careers.
That's great. And as they see their work produced on your website and picked up by other outlets, it probably really encourages them. So,
well, it's nice to see your name in print. That's always a thrill, especially early in a career when you're just beginning. But with this website, you can see your name, in pixels, I guess. You can show it to your parents. And sometimes they'll get on a radio station because of the work they've done, or even occasionally on television. That's always a thrill to get that kind of attention, to get a sense that you're writing things that people are reading, you're having some influence, and maybe making a difference.
So in our last minutes, are you optimistic for the future of journalism? Pessimistic? What's your take?
Well, I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to encourage more conservatives and libertarians into the business. That's what I'm trying to do at the College Fix. It's what I'm trying to do at Hillsdale College, and I think we're having some success. Now, it's a tremendous challenge to change the culture of America's newsrooms, but I do think we can do a better job. It's hard to do a worse job, I suppose, than what we're doing right now. But I think we can encourage some bright young people to go in, and our news coverage will improve. We will always have fake news. We will never have a period where there's no fake news at all. We might call it by a different thing in the future. But we can also have good journalism. There's a lot of good journalism out there today. You need to know where to look for it, but it can be found. It's never been better, the good stuff.
Well, that's fantastic. A great note to end on. So thank you for joining us today, John J. Miller. Great information for our audience. Appreciate you having visited with us, and that you'll be speaking to the Liberty Forum, who sponsors our program.
Thanks, Shane.
Thank you. So every month, on the second Tuesday of every month, you can see great speakers like John J. Miller at the Liberty Forum at IFES Hall, 432 Stearland Road in Mountain View. In December, Nick Adams, the founder of a group called the Foundation for Liberty and American Greatness, or FLAG, will be speaking. In January, James Lilacs, American journalist, columnist, and blogger, frequent contributor to National Review's magazine and website. And in February, it's Michelle Malkin, American journalist, columnist, and blogger. So catch all those great programs coming up at the Liberty Forum.